this is Jessica and Noam, and this is Drums Through the Decades. This will be us exploring drum sounds and how they were recorded over the past 70 years. We are starting in the 1950s. Let's roll back the clock.
From the first recorded sounds in the late 1800s through the 40s, recording technology increased dramatically every year. By the 50s, they had a lot of the tools that ended up shaping the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Today we're going to look at 3 different recordings. We have Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, Elvis Presley's Jailhouse Rock, and Ray Charles' What Did I Say? Let's get into it.
In order to understand how things were recorded in the 50s, we have to understand how things got there. In the late 1800s, when people started recording sounds, music, the medium left a lot to be desired. They were recording entirely with mechanical devices. It was a horn that would go to a stylus, which would make imprints on like soft material like wax or tin, and it was a generally very inaccurate and low fidelity way of recording.
In the 1920s, electronics were incorporated into the recording process, but still the early electronic recordings were very primitive. In order to record a band, they would use a singular Omni microphone, and you had to control the volume by having players stand close or far away from the mic, and it was a very ineffective way to record. Although magnetic tape would be invented in 1928, most recordings were still being cut straight to disc, and the frequency response was very inaccurate.
By the 1940s, they were in the big band era. They started using multiple microphones on a bunch of stuff to capture everyone. They were not necessarily recording all those things onto individual tracks. They were bussing them down into single tracks, and the drums rarely got a microphone on them because they would kind of just bleed into everything else. By the mid-40s, late 40s, the tape machines started getting invented. So the 2-track came in 43, the 3-track came in 48. Even though they were around, they weren't really getting used much until the 1950s.
Tape unlocked a whole new world of sonic possibilities. Not only could it produce higher fidelity recordings, but it could be edited, copied, and reproduced without significant generation loss, unlike the direct-to-disc recordings. Tape also allowed for multi-track recording and overdubbing, which was nearly impossible before. By the mid-1950s, the energy and quality of recordings had changed immensely.
Beyond just the recording, the drums themselves were playing a huge part in the sound. The drummers at the time were mostly jazz drummers. And so the kits they were using were largely the types of kits that you would use in a jazz setting. It was all smaller sizes, right? 18 to 20 inch kick drums, floor toms were 14 inches, rack toms were often 12 or 10 inches. Everything was open, right? There was very little muffling involved in the drums, and they would let the overtones ring out. And largely, they would use calfskin heads at the time. Even though synthetic heads did exist, they were not terribly popular in the 50s. And so these calfskin heads would substantially darken the sound of the drums.
So today we used a modern day reproduction of a 50s style kit. We have the Gretsch Catalina Club Kit. It has a 20-inch kick drum, a 12-inch rack tom, and a 14-inch floor tom. And then we have a vintage Ludwig snare drum. For our cymbals, we used 14-inch K-Dark hats and a 20-inch K-Dark crash ride.
So for Bill Haley and the Comets, this sound is super exemplary of what pretty much all of the 50s drum sounds are going to be. There's a lot of commonality between the way that they were recording all of these different types of bands, all of these different types of sounds. They were limited on the mic selection. They were limited on how many tracks they could record to, and they were limited on the effects that they had. So we can kind of, even though there isn't a ton of information on what exactly they were using, we can make really, really educated guesses as to what types of things they might have been doing. The most defining feature of this decade is the limited track count and the limited mics that they were using. You got to remember that they're coming from a time period where they are recording the whole band with one mic. And because of that, the idea of, even though they had the capability of recording more than 3 microphones at a time, right? They could have recorded 10 microphones and bust them down to 3 channels. It wasn't really occurring to them that much because the idea was still so fresh that you were going to use multiple microphones at all. Because of this, you are not only sticking a microphone on the drum set as a whole, you are sticking a microphone on the vocalist, you are sticking a microphone on the bassist. You might be, rather than sticking a microphone on the bassist, you might be sticking a microphone on the entire band. And each of those microphones, they're in the same room generally with the drums, so they're all gonna pick up tons and tons of drums. It's kind of equivalent to if you are recording a drum set and you think about anything that you do to a snare drum microphone is going to affect the way that the hi-hat sounds. Anything that you do to a bottom snare microphone is going to affect the attack of the kick drum. All these things are related. It's like that, but zoomed out to the entire band. So more than half of the drum sound of the drums themselves is coming from the vocal mic. More than half of the low end of the drum set is coming from that bass microphone. We did have a mic on the drums. It was just positioned kind of in front. We did a lot of moving that microphone around. That was kind of what you did at the time, right? Was you only had one mic, so the balance of the different instruments and the balance of the room ambience versus the direct sound of the drums, that is all done by the way that the drummer is playing, and it is done by where you position that microphone and what mic you use. If you put it lower, it's going to get more low end. If you put it higher, it's generally going to get a bit more cymbals. So we're kind of putting it just maybe a foot in front of the kit and a bit high and kind of aiming down at like in between the snare drum and the kick drum. So we used an Electro Voice 674, which is a microphone of that era. It is a dynamic microphone. It's really kind of a bit nasal, and it doesn't have a ton of high-end extension or low-end extension, but it's really, really appropriate for the kind of limited frequency range of those drum kits. We also had up a quote-unquote vocal mic, right? We didn't have a vocalist, obviously, but we stuck a microphone that would be like where the vocalist would have been. That was an RCA 44. It is a bidirectional ribbon mic, so we stuck it where the null point, right, the point that is canceling out, was facing the drum. There was not a lot of direct drum kit sound in that. It was just picking up a lot of the room. We also had a quote-unquote bass mic, right? We had a mic kind of lower to the floor over in the corner of the room. This was an RCA 77. Again, a ribbon microphone. We used the null point of that mic so that we could get as little direct drums as possible. And we had it lower to the ground, so it picked up a bit more low end on this kit. As far as EQ, there was a few tube-based EQs that existed at the time. Their choices were kind of limited, but Pultecs were already around and they were very, very popular. So we utilized a lot of Pultec on this. We did a lot of filtering off the extreme highs and kind of pushing some of the lower high end, pushing some of the more 8K, 10K, 5K range. We also added a decent amount of low end with the Pultec because Again, we don't have a kick drum microphone, so any of the low end is gonna kind of come from EQing the overhead essentially to get some of the low end out of it. We also use the cut on the Pultec just to get rid of a bit of the like mid-range mud, which was also very common at the time. As far as compression, there was not a lot of compressors that existed in the 50s, right? Compression was really a much newer thing, and it wasn't really being used creatively at all yet. The only use of compression at the time was for protection. So they would use compressors as a way to limit the dynamic range of things that they were putting out over the radio. They would use it to limit the dynamic range of what they were cutting to vinyl. If your vinyl was too dynamic, had too big of a dynamic range, there would be physical issues with the vinyl, right? So when they were printing stuff to vinyl, they would run it through a compressor. So lots of the compression that you might hear in these old recordings, they're kind of a byproduct of the medium that they had to work with. So today we didn't put compression on any of the individual channels. We did put a compressor on the overall mix. That compressor was a recreation of a gate stay level made by a company called Retro. This was one of just a handful of compressors that even existed at the time. Even though largely in the 50s, recording engineers were kind of technicians still, right? They were not making super creative choices. They were still just capturing what was happening in a room to present. They started to make these choices that were in fact creative and musical. The best example of this is the reverbs. In the 40s, all the reverbs, for the most part, were just the natural reverb of the room. And in the 50s, they started using things like chamber reverbs, right? Which is where they would take the signal from one of the microphones, they would run it to a speaker, which was inside of a room that was especially reverberant, right? These are custom-built rooms that are meant to be, like basketball courts, like really reverby rooms. And then they would stick another microphone or a pair of microphones in there and capture that sound and use it as a special effect to make everything sound more epic, more stylized. This was one of the earliest special effects in music. This was one of the earliest sounds that were not just happening in the room when they recorded it. They would add it in post to make the recordings more special. So for today, to recreate that, we ended up using a UAD Capitol Chambers, which is a beautiful sounding chamber from Capitol Records. So for Jailhouse Rock, the microphone placement, very, very similar. We used all the same mics. We EQ'd it slightly differently. We turned down the chamber reverb a little bit. And the biggest thing that we added was a slapback delay. Now, this is a super common effect nowadays, obviously, but at the time, this was completely groundbreaking. You got to remember that tape did not it wasn't even being used a few years before these recordings, right? These are all really, really brand new technologies. And not only are they using tape and they're recording to this new medium where they can do all this stuff, they are also messing up the way to use that. They're abusing those recording techniques and creating totally new creative effects that completely shape the sound of that decade just from kind of the misuse of this equipment. So to do a tape slap, it is relying on a second tape machine, right? You have your tape machine that you are recording the band to. You have a second tape machine set up. And you send a little bit of the signal that you are recording, let's say of the vocal, to that second tape machine. The second tape machine is recording that vocal as well. And the playback of that recording is then going back to the first tape machine and getting either recorded onto another track, or more often it's just getting fed from the mixing board into a separate channel so that when they do the mix down, they can kind of add this effect. The effect comes from the physical difference between the record head and the playback head on a tape machine. The tape is kind of flowing through the head stack, and the playback head is just physically a few inches away from the record head. And the tape has to travel from one to the other. And that takes some time. Roughly, depending on what speed you're going at like 15 IPS, the time is about 120 milliseconds, 130 milliseconds, something like that. As the tape is recorded onto the tape, it travels to the playback head and then gets played 130 milliseconds later. And the result is you have delay. And you have delay for kind of the first time ever in history, right? They had no way of hearing something slightly later than when it was actually happening. Wasn't really existing before then. Not only do you have a delay that you can fold into the mix, right, and create this kind of depth and stylized sound to the vocals, you could cause regeneration with that effect, right? So you could take a little bit of the feed of the delayed signal, right? You have your vocal, you have your delay. If you take a little bit of that delay and you feed it back into itself, you feed it back into the signal that's getting recorded to that delay tape machine, all of a sudden, not only do you get 120 millisecond delay, but you get another 120 millisecond delay after that, and another one after that. Depending how much you add to it, you will get kind of a trail of delay that is, many delays in once, and they're kind of going down in volume over time. All of these things had never been done before, and they ended up being such a huge part of Elvis's sound. Many would say that they are the quintessential defining sound of what his vocals felt like was the slapback delay. Because his vocals were recorded in the same room as the drums, not only did you get that slapback delay on the vocals, you got it a bit on the drums as well. Rock Around the Clock was 54, Jailhouse Rock was 57. We are now at 59, and this is Ray Charles' What I Say. There is a stark difference in terms of fidelity here, right? You can immediately hear that something in the medium is improving. This is largely because their engineer, Tom Dowd, was a pioneer in multi-track recording, and he was getting the literally tape machines that no one else had. It was like him and Les Paul that had an actual 8-track at the time, and he was starting to record things on 8 whopping tracks, which was lapping everyone else making records at the time. So For the drums, that did not mean that they were all of a sudden close miking a bunch of stuff. They were still very, very minimal with the drum miking, and we're still just using one mic on the drums. But it means that there is more mics in the room, first off, right? There is more mics capturing more things, and that's definitely going to change the sound of the drums a bit. It also just means that he has all this more flexibility, that he can be much more decisive with the sound. He can shape it more specifically, and he's less at the mercy of just all of the things that are happening in the room. Hand in hand with this is they started to isolate things a little bit more. You can hear in this recording, right? We don't have any actual information on like what it looked like when they were recording this, but just from listening to it, you can hear that the effects on the vocals are a bit different than the effects on the drums. The drums have noticeably less reverb than the vocals do. And the only way to achieve this is to start putting up baffles, right? Start putting people in separate rooms or start just isolating people in general. So these drums are just a bit more refined, right? They're not just blown up because they were so scared of tape hiss, right? They're starting to be more intentional with the way that they're shaping these sounds. These sounds have more separation between the different instruments. They have a bit more high end. You can really just feel that the general fidelity is getting higher-fi. The closeness that we were hearing, right, the impact that we were hearing, we knew that it was partially from them turning down the reverbs, right, on the drums themselves, which again, you had to isolate things to do. But we initially thought that that would mean us bringing in all of the microphones a little bit closer to the drums. We thought that it would mean turning down all of the microphones that were not directly on the drums. And as soon as we started doing that, we figured out that it wasn't really working, right? So we started just moving the mics around. And what we landed on is that the room was a bit smaller. Where they were recording this stuff feels a bit tighter. It feels like a closer room sound. But there's still lots and lots of depth that's coming from all these extra microphones that they were now using. So even though they might have not been using as much reverb, they might have not been using as big of a space, because we had all these extra tracks, because we started using more microphones, we got a slightly different version of a roomy sound, right? We got a roomy sound that was coming from more places in the room that were being captured, rather than just the sheer size of the room or the sheer size of a chamber nearby. This has been Drums Through the Decades, the 1950s.
Let us know in the comments what your favorite sounds from the 50s are, and stay tuned for our next episode of Drums Through the Decades when we cover the 1960s. We'll see you next time.